All right, great. We'll get started in a minute. Um, Having a conversation with Dr. Lucas Wilson. One thing I want to name right off the bat is that we will be recording the entire time for this conversation. So if you have any questions or comments that you would like to keep anonymous, you can include them in the chat and just name at the front of it, like keep this anonymous, and one of us will read it out loud without including your name, so that we can get questions asked and answered, and also so that folks who watch later can get all that information as well. Yeah, to start us off, I'm Avery Arden. I'm the programming chair for More Light Presbyterians, and I'm really excited to have Dr. Lucas Wilson with us today. Um, Lucas does really important work from various intersections, including the focus of today, which is conversion practices. His latest book is Shame, Sex, Attraction: Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy, which is what we're centering on today. But he's also written several books on the Holocaust and second generational trauma that comes out of that. And he's also working on two more anthologies right now that are about Christian colleges' anti-queer regimes and LGBTQ plus religious trauma in general. Um, these topics, unfortunately, are things that are very much pertinent today, even in spaces where I imagine most of you come from more affirming spaces where you're like, oh yeah, of course we don't have like blatant conversion therapy. We know that is wrong. But some of the sort of ideologies that go into those therapies are still sort of just floating in the water in which we swim. So yeah, that's what I've got. Dr. Lucas Wilson, what else do you want folks to know before we dive in?
Well, first and foremost, it's a pleasure to be here, joining everyone by way of Zoom. Hi, everyone. My name's Luke or Lucas Wilson, whichever you prefer. Just don't call me late for supper. I'm excited to be here and to chit chat with y'all. I'm gonna offer maybe about 10 minutes of just overview, and then we're gonna jump into a conversation. And it's always more fun to actually dialogue. So please do ask any and all questions. I'm very excited to be in dialogue with you all today. So I actually began, as Avery said, Avery alluded to the fact that I began my academic career in Holocaust studies. I looked mostly at the intergenerational transmission.
Someone taking more of the wine?
Pardon me. Oh, that was not for me. Pardon me. Okay. Um, so I began my academic career in Holocaust studies, looking at the intergenerational transmission of trauma between Holocaust survivors, their kids, and their grandkids. And before that, I actually looked at how Christian theology laid the seedbed for the Holocaust. So I didn't really necessarily look too much at the Holocaust itself. But given the current political and social and religious landscape in which we live, some might say hellscape in which we live, I decided to redirect my academic focus and concentrate largely on white Christian nationalism, specifically looking at white Christian nationalists' understandings of gender and sexuality, and even more particularly looking at conversion practices within this movement, within these contexts. And so today we're obviously going to be talking about conversion therapy. To situate things, I will say up front that I went through conversion therapy for 4 years at Liberty University. For anyone who knows who Jerry Falwell is, I had the displeasure of attending his college. And for the 4 years that I was in attendance, I was going through their one-on-one conversion therapy. I went to the group conversion therapy program once, and I write about that actually in Shame, Sex, Attraction, the book that we're going to be referencing throughout the night. But for my next book, which is about LGBTQ experiences at Christian colleges, universities, seminaries, and divinity schools, I write about my experience on the one-on-one program there and what led me to that. And so this work for me is in part personal, but it's also in part academic. And so I'm really looking in large, the big picture is looking at how Christian higher education not only subjects LGBTQ students to conversion practices, but how they export a lot of that hatred off campus through different means, whether it be their quote unquote think tanks, through their alumni network, through their professors, et cetera, et cetera. So tonight we're obviously again talking about conversion therapy, and there are numerous consequences for folks that folks experience after going through conversion therapy, whether they be psychological, emotional, physical, or spiritual. And all of this that I'm talking about, any one part that I referenced tonight, I'd love to go into more detail if any of this is of interest. But what I will say, and this is according to the research from a recent Canadian study on conversion therapy, the effects of conversion therapy on survivors, the number one cited consequence of conversion practices is shame, as the title of the book suggests. And so shame factors really prominently in conversion practices. It's both what brings people oftentimes in, right? Not everyone goes into conversion therapy willingly. However, for those who quote unquote decide to go in or make the quote unquote choice, we can talk more about agency later. But for those folks who are going into it quote unquote willfully, the main motivating factor is shame, right? This internalized homophobia and or transphobia and which motivates people to actually subject themselves to these practices. I also would say that the number one consequence, and again, according to the research, is shame, right? So it's what brings people into conversion therapy, and it's again the number one factor for or the consequence of these practices afterwards. And this is, of course, building on, not just shame, but guilt, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, but actually not just suicidal ideation, lifetime suicidal ideation. Folks who have undergone conversion practices experience lifetime suicidal ideation, not uncommonly. And so these are some of the consequences. I'm going to give a brief history and really try to bring it up to the modern or sort of the contemporary moment with the Supreme Court case. And again, we can go into that, and I would love to chat about that. There's been a lot of misinformation about the Supreme Court case. And in some case, I would argue disinformation about the Supreme Court case. It's not as doom and gloom as people have made it out to be. It's not a good situation, to be sure, but it's also not what a lot of folks have said it is. And again, I really do blame a lot of media outlets, including, unfortunately, queer media outlets, for spreading a lot of, again, mis and or disinformation. And so conversion practices, I will say, and I always want to reference this, but I focus mostly on the modern context. But what I will say is that conversion practices have been happening in North America for centuries. Ever since there have been uninvited settlers and colonizers who have come into these lands that we now know as North America, whether it be Canada, the United States, or Mexico, these folks brought with them a lot of gendered assumptions and a lot of gender norms that they then tried to map onto Indigenous populations. And so I want to reference that. I want to acknowledge that this is not a new history. It's just changed to how it's been deployed. But again, I'm going to focus on the modern context, but I would be remiss not to mention that. And so conversion practices, these are practices that really actually begin in the secular context. And we're going to be talking more about religion, especially as time goes on. But I want to first note that in the mid 1800s, this was the first time that the words heterosexual and homosexual came into any modern lexicon, or any lexicon at all, I should say. Up until this point, sexuality was not understood in terms of identity as much as it was understood in terms of actions, right? So you did certain things that were sexual, but it wasn't defining you as a person. However, when all of a sudden we have these terms homosexual and heterosexual, homosexuality and heterosexuality, this is where there was this shift in how people understood sexuality. They started to understand this as not just, again, what you did, but a function of who you are, right? So this ontological understanding of sexuality. So then what happened was that, of course, the moment that we had an understanding of homosexuality, this was the negative measure against which heterosexuality was understood. And folks were thinking, how do we change these people who are, sick or twisted or whatever, and align them with the heteronormative model? And again, how do we make these folks heterosexual? They wouldn't have used the word heteronormative. This is a much more recent term, but nonetheless, the idea remains. And so they started to try to change people and change them into heterosexuals. And so a lot of the early conversion practices were in the medical community. So we're thinking specifically of forced lobotomies. After that, there was actually a Canadian invention. I am Canadian, I should say. I should have admitted this up front. But it's an unfortunate Canadian invention. And so it was testicular transplantation as a conversion practice. So it was taking the testicles of presumably straight men and implanting them in gay or homosexual men as an effort to change these folks and how they identified sexually. From there, we fast forward into around the 1950s and 60s, and this is when we have a lot of conversion practices taking place in psychiatric and psychological communities. And so different theories were, of course, in circulation from the 1800s in around the turn of the century and beyond, right? We can think of our friend Freud and his friends and, post-Freudian thinkers and then psychologists and psychiatrists afterwards. A lot of the theories in the 50s and 60s really were the overbearing mother theory, right? So that young gay boys were queer because they had an overbearing mother who, really kept them within the world of femininity. And by the time that they were, hitting puberty, they went for what was quote unquote opposite of them. And of course, if we're thinking about gender and sexuality on a binary, which these folks certainly were, what would have been opposite, quote unquote, was masculinity. So they were attracted to boys and then eventually men. And so this was a theory. Another theory was early childhood sexual trauma, right? Molestation being a cause for queerness. And then folks, again, trying to think, okay, how do we change these queer boys, queer men, queer girls, queer women, and again, change them. And so there was a lot of talk therapy at the time. This was also the time where electroshock therapy was certainly in vogue. Anywhere from Brigham Young University, a Mormon institution, all the way to Harvard, a secular institution or quote unquote secular institution, right? That this was again quite common. And so all of these conversion practices for a long time, really in this modern context, were happening again in the medical, psychiatric, and psychological communities. But then the 1970s happened, and 1973 was a very important year for two reasons. One, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, declassified, so the APA, the American Psychological Association, the Board of Trustees declassified homosexuality as a pathology, which of course was a win for queer rights, for queer communities. But 1973 was also the year that I always say Jesus hit the scene. And what I mean by that is that this is where the first ex-gay ministry opened up. This is not to say there were not conversion practices happening in churches and religious communities before. There absolutely were. And on top of that, the first ex-gay ministry was actually did not open in the US. It actually opened in Australia. However, if we are thinking about North America specifically, the first ex-gay ministry opened up in Southern California. The ministry was called Love in Action. They eventually moved around, eventually to Memphis, but they were a Southern California invention. The next year, Exit, the ex-gay interventionist team, they emerge in 1974. 2 years later, these different ex-gay ministries, it was specifically the Exit. They were the ones who co-hosted this conference. They brought together delegates from ex-gay ministries across the US, and they formed that year at that conference essentially a league of these different ministries, and they named that league of ministries Exodus. Exodus would later become Exodus International when it went across national or international borders. And this would become, of course, the largest, most powerful, and best funded ex-gay ministry in the world. They were incredibly influential, and we'll talk more about when they closed their doors. And so these different ministries were largely trading in theological ideas and theories about sexuality, and also theological practices, or theologically informed practices, I should say, to treat queer folks in their midst. And so they were really thinking about homosexuality, the cause of it being sin, and then different practices, whether it be fasting or prayer or, meeting together and fellowshipping as ways to overcome queerness. But then around the late 1970s and into the 80s, this is where these different ex-gay ministries joined forces with ex-gay researchers. And I put the term researcher very loosely in quotation marks. These were folks who had PhDs, but they were really mixing and matching a lot of the theories that they wanted as they related to their theological convictions. And so the ex-gay ministries latched onto these researchers because these researchers afforded them, at least in their own estimation, credibility. Right? They were like, look at this. We have these PhDs, we have these Christian psychologists who are saying what we're saying, both in terms of theology, but also in terms of psychology. They're substantiating our claims. Isn't that great? Well, The other group, the Christian researchers or the ex-gay researchers, what they were getting from these ex-gay ministries was money. All of a sudden, they had people who were buying their books, buying their tapes, inviting them to conferences, inviting them to their churches, to their ministries, whatever. And so these two groups joined this or formed this symbiotic relationship and really formed the foundation of the ex-gay movement in the U.S. And it sort of snowballed from the 80s and into the 90s. And this was the height of the ex-gay movement. But what happens in the late 90s and into the 2000s is that we started to see a number of the leaders fall from grace, right? So we can think of John Polk being photographed at a Washington, D.C. gay bar. It was somewhat of a shot to his credibility, being found there, right? As someone who had apparently reformed his sexuality and married a woman. We can think of other folks who were found in places like meth-fueled orgies in the sides of highways in motel rooms, right? Again, not a cute look when you're trying to say that you've changed your sexuality. And so a lot of these leaders start to fall, and a number of them on their way out and after acknowledge that not only did they never change, but no one changed. And so this again was a shot to their credibility. And one at this, today we would think, oh, wow, wouldn't that have been sort of the end of the ex-gay movement? Regrettably, no. Really, the difference was, and the shift was at this point, was that they stopped advertising to those outside their communities and really just started concentrating on those within the fold. So they, up until this point, they were advertising on billboards, magazine covers, newspaper articles, classified ads. But then they stopped doing that because they were like, well, I don't think a lot of people really believe us anymore, but we still have some traction within our religious communities. And so they really concentrated inward. And so we fast forward to 2013. This was a bombshell moment. This is when Exodus International eventually closed its doors. You might have heard of the last president of Exodus in the news recently, Alan Chambers. He was soliciting sex with minors. Again, didn't necessarily work. This conversion therapy did it. And so when Exodus closes its doors, again, one would only expect that when the largest, most powerful flagship organization closes up shop, that again, this movement would end. It didn't. What we see today is that conversion practices persist. Perhaps the most well-known and the most public-facing conversion therapy organization or ex-gay ministry is the Changed movement. They're also coming out of California. There's a lot going on in California. I don't know what, but they're in Redding, California, out of Bethel Church. They also have a school for supernatural ministry, to give you an idea of what kind of school this is or what kind of institution this is. And so this group, really, they are the ones who are on social media. If you look them up on Instagram, if you look them up on different platforms, you can see they have a very active media presence. Or social media presence, but on top of that, a very active media presence. They go to, when SCOTUS was making its decision, they went to the Capitol, right? When, other decisions are made across the country, they go and they protest or they offer their support for these different organizations. So this is really the most, again, public-facing and prominent or ex-gay organization today. But this is not the only form of conversion therapy that's still happening. I will say that, and the research backs this up, is that the vast majority of conversion practices are happening in high control Christian contexts. This is not to say that all Christian denominations support conversion therapy. By no means. We know that there are a number of progressive faith traditions, and thank goodness for these progressive faith traditions, because I would say that a lot of these progressive faith traditions are actually at the forefront of protesting and combating conversion therapy. So there's a lot of really phenomenal work being done. But as for the high control Christian context, right? So we're thinking white Christian fundamentalists, we're thinking white Christian nationalists, we're thinking a lot of conservative evangelical traditions. These are the organizations that are practicing a lot of the conversion therapy that we know of today. And so the SCOTUS case, I told you we would get to that. So this is a case coming out of the state of Colorado. This is actually not a case that's connecting to churches. This is actually a case for licensed practitioners and professionals, which, what I will say is that in the US, the legislation is quite limited in comparison to a lot of other places in the world, like Australia and Canada and other places in the Commonwealth. In the US, only children are protected under the law, and only children are protected under the law when it's in the context of a licensed clinician, right? So that means that anyone who's in a religious space can still practice conversion therapy and not get in trouble. If you are a licensed clinician, that's only when you cannot practice conversion therapy if there's actually a ban in the state in which you practice. So these are really, really, really limited laws. They're really helpful in a lot of ways, right? They're laying the groundwork in a lot of ways, but again, they are extremely limited, again, at least in comparison to a lot of other places in the world. And so when we're thinking about the case, the SCOTUS case that recently happened in Colorado, there was a conversion. Well, you know what? I say conversion therapist. She's not. She's actually never practiced conversion therapy. Kaylee Childs. She was just chosen by the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF, which is an incredibly powerful and an incredibly scary alt-right organization that takes on a lot of legal cases. She was chosen by them to be the figure or the face of this lawsuit. And so what she was arguing was that she should be able to practice conversion therapy if she wants to, as a licensed clinician on and practice conversion therapy on youth because of freedom of speech, in the name of freedom of speech, I should say, which is a crazy argument. Like, to put it academically, it's absolutely bonkers. This was the argument that, again, in the name of free speech, that she should be able to practice conversion therapy. Of course, any professional, if we're talking about a mental health professional, if we're talking a medical doctor, if we're talking about an engineer, any professional, whoever's in the professions, every single person who's practicing, again, in a certain profession has a code of conduct that they must abide by, right? And the crazy thing here is that typically your freedom of speech is superseded by this code of conduct. If you're a doctor and you want to spew a lot of racist drivel, you're not allowed when you're on the clock because, well, there's a code of conduct. In the same way, Kaylee Childs should never have been able to practice conversion therapy simply because she has the right to free speech. Again, your right to free speech is superseded by these codes of conduct. But the Supreme Court decided they sided in favor of Kaylee Childs. And as a result, Kaylee Childs is now free to practice conversion therapy on youth as a licensed practitioner in the state of Colorado. Now, this is the case, right? Kaylee Childs is allowed to practice conversion therapy. What a lot of folks have been saying is that the statewide ban has been struck down. Not true. A lot of folks have been saying that statewide bans in other states have been struck down. Not true. Kaylee Childs approached this case as a facial challenge to the ban. What that means is, if in fact she were to be successful, which she was, she would be able to practice conversion therapy and no one else. It was not what's called a facial challenge. A facial challenge, sorry, she had an as applied challenge. What she would, if she wanted to change the ban for everyone who's a licensed practitioner, that would be called what's a facial challenge. Pardon me, I mixed the two up. She challenged the ban so that only she would be able to practice conversion therapy if she had a successful outcome, and again, she did. So this is the good news, right? That only one person in the state of Colorado, again, it's not good news in, in a lot of senses, but the good news is it's only one person in the state of Colorado is able to practice conversion therapy, and that's Kaylee Childs. No other licensed practitioner can. Now, of course, there is a lot of symbolic weight to this decision, right? Not only is it laying the potential groundwork for there to be a facial challenge to the law, which would allow other practitioners to practice conversion therapy, but on top of that, we've already seen in other states challenges to the statewide bans, right? So this is very much symbolic at this point. But like I said, it's absolutely not the end of the world. And so we have a lot of hope. The ADF wants us to think that the case is done, but this is actually still a live case. The case was sent back to the 10th Circuit. So this case is still ongoing. And so what we need to do is to continue to be loud, to continue to raise awareness, and to continue to talk about conversion therapy and put pressure on the courts to make the right and moral and ethical decision. Will that happen? We'll see. But for right now, again, it's not sort of doom and gloom the way that a lot of people have framed it. But it is, again, something to take seriously and something to continue to be vocal and loud about. And so what does this mean for progressive churches? I think that in a lot of ways, the implications for progressive churches are really the implications for everyone, right? I would say that conservative, alt-right, far-right religious traditions and denominations and congregations, they're not going to listen. They have no interest. And so that's that. However, for everyone else, I think that this case and, the state of affairs in the US right now is that we need to continue to push against not just conversion therapy, but conversion practices. Now, what's the difference? Conversion therapy is part of what we would identify as conversion practices. Conversion practices are the umbrella, and conversion therapy is, in a lot of ways, a small section of that. Conversion therapy is very much a programmatic attempt, a very intentional attempt to change an individual's sexual orientation, gender identity, and/or gender expression, right? So this is very much a concentrated space of homophobia and transphobia and trying to change people to align them with the heteronormative model in whether it be a church basement, a pastor's office, a licensed or an unlicensed clinician, right, or a practitioner. We can think of even within families that conversion therapy can arguably take place. And so this is, again, it's very programmatic. There's a set in stone, a very thought out program. If we're thinking more broadly of conversion practices, these are practices and messages that communicate to queer folks that being queer is not okay, that it's a problem that needs to be fixed, an ailment that needs to be cured. So this, for a lot of us, and I would say that although not everyone's gone through conversion therapy who falls under the LGBTQ umbrella, I would say that every single queer person and trans person has experienced conversion practices. These are things as everyday as saying, don't sit like that, you look like a girl, don't play with that, those are boys' toys. Don't look like that, don't talk like that, don't talk to them, talk to them, right? Messaging that accumulates throughout our lives and tries to align us with that heteronormative model. It's also practices, right? So getting beaten for, expressing oneself in non-heteronormative terms, right? Whether it be at the schoolyard or at someone's house, whatever, right? There are these practices, but again, also these messages. And so these are what we refer to as conversion practices. For those of us who are doing research on the topic, or academics or survivors or activists and allies, right? These are the terms that we use to describe these very broad range of practices that are ubiquitous throughout religious institutions, throughout the family, throughout educational institutions, throughout society writ large. And so this is why when we talk about conversion therapy, it's important, because it's not just that we're talking about conversion therapy. When we zoom out just a little bit, we see that these practices affect every single queer person, and arguably in some cases, even hetero or straight folks. We can talk more about that after, but I'll put a pin in that for now. Anywho, I've spoken a lot. I don't want to speak as much right now. I would rather be in conversation. I have not looked at the chat. I saw that there were some alerts, but I will pass it back over to Avery, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucas. One thing I wanted to ask that's a quick question is, I remember in our chat a while ago you mentioned like the sort of statistics as far as we know, how many people currently are going through or have like gone through conversion therapies. Can you remind me what that number was?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about the US specifically, there's different stats for different countries, but we're in the US context tonight. So the number is coming from the Williams Institute. The Williams Institute is out of UCLA. They do a lot of phenomenal work about LGBT communities in general, but when it comes to conversion therapy, the most recent number that we have is coming from them. At this point, it's a little bit outdated, but nonetheless, it's a good place to start. So the number in the US, according to the Williams Institute, it's estimated that about 700,000 adults have undergone conversion practices in the US. This is about 7% of LGBTQ communities, or 12%. It's 12 or 7% of LGBTQ communities. I mean, a large percentage no matter what. But whenever I bring this up, this number of 700, about 700,000, it's 698,000, but neither here nor there. Whenever I bring this statistic up, I always think it's super important to treble this number a little bit and to call it into question. Not because I'm not grateful for their research, I'm super grateful for their research, but I think that there's a methodological problem for this this statistic that we'll never overcome, no matter what. And that problem is the problem of self-reporting, which is a two-pronged problem. The problem with self-reporting in the first case is that whenever we are asking folks, have they undergone conversion therapy, a lot of survivors do not recognize their experience in conversion therapy as conversion therapy. I can use myself as an example. And this is, of course, anecdotal, but just to give you an idea about how this can be true. So I went through all 4 years of conversion therapy at Liberty University. I went through what was called pastoral counseling. It's a euphemism for conversion therapy. And this is something that I understood again as pastoral counseling. So when I left Liberty, I went straight into my MA and my Master's of Arts. And it was there that I had an office mate. And we were chatting one day, and I think she kind of thought I was an alien because I had gone to school in the US. I'm Canadian, but I'd gone to school in the US at Liberty University, like the most US sounding institution I think ever. It's very, no, there's no school in Canada called that. And so my classmates were kind of like, who the heck is this guy? And they knew because I was very vocal about being an evangelical until I kind of realized maybe I should shut up and stop talking about this because people in the academy were not necessarily sympathetic. So I had a lot of questions. And so one day my office mate and I were chatting and she said, like, tell me more about your experience. What was it like at Liberty? And so I started telling her. And then at the end of it, she said, so you went through conversion therapy. And I was like, no. I was like, no, I went through pastoral counseling. And in my mind, again, I had, of course, heard of conversion therapy. I didn't live under a rock per se, maybe in some senses, but in this case, I had heard of it. And so I knew of conversion therapy, but I have not once ever identified my experience as conversion therapy. I just thought of it as pastoral counseling, that I was meeting with this pastor to help me work through my unwanted same-sex attractions, which is the way that we framed it. And so I afterwards went out and did a quick Google search just to like double check that like I didn't go through conversion therapy. And sure enough, like item by item, I was like, check, check, check. Like all of this is exactly what I was taught and what I was made to believe. And when I was at McMaster, at the new school that I was studying, I still believed all of this. I still thought that it was possible to change. And so nonetheless, it all the reason why I tell you this story is because again, that's one example of so many examples of people who have been through conversion therapy, who when they all of a sudden are asked, have you been through conversion therapy on a questionnaire or a survey? They're of course going to answer no, because in their minds, they didn't go through that. They oftentimes the move is to downplay our experiences and to say, no, I just met with a pastor. No, that was just my youth group leader who was telling me things. No, X, Y, and Z. However, what it is again, definitional conversion therapy. And so the problem with that is that when we have these surveys, when we have these questionnaires, they're not going to be accurate per se, at least in that sense. So that's the first problem with self-reporting. The other problem with self-reporting is that the vast majority of people who undergo conversion therapy are still within these religious communities. Just because you take someone out of conversion therapy doesn't mean that they leave this religious community, right? So a lot of these folks who have undergone these practices remain within high control Christian spaces. They still go to these churches, they still teach at these schools. They're still a part of this world. And so this is a world of a number of different denominations that are highly skeptical of science, of research-based claims, of medicine, of public health. We can think back to COVID-19 when masks were a political issue. We can think of where the majority of anti-vaxxers come from, these high-control Christian spaces. These are people who don't trust science. They don't trust researchers, right? So all of a sudden, when a queer researcher comes around, or even if it's a straight researcher who comes around and says, "Hey, do you want to take part in my study of an LGBTQ, communities?" They're gonna be like, not at all, right? And these are people who, if they're not still in conversion therapy, they at least support conversion therapy. So they're not going to trust these folks from the Godless Academy, as they oftentimes put it, because these are populations that they don't trust. So we're never really going to have accurate numbers. We're never going to have people, again, if you ask a number of the folks who've gone through conversion therapy who are still within these spaces, they're going to say, that's not conversion therapy. That was my pastor helping me find wholeness and holiness. Again, it's these rhetorical and mental gymnastics that they are forced to perform in order to remain within the fold. And so again, the numbers we have just will never be accurate, at least in the way that we would hope for. Again, this is not to poo-poo, the Williams Institute and the research that's already been done. Again, we're so thankful for those numbers because it gives us a really strong place to start. But my whole point is that I think that the numbers are actually quite low, and the statistics that we have are quite low in comparison to the actual number. Yes, exactly, Eileen. Exactly.
Yeah, just to read Helene's comment out loud for the recording later. Similar stories of not self-identifying apply to women who have experienced sexual abuses. Yeah, yeah. And I think um that leads well into like narratives of erasure, which just makes me I'm gonna open it to anyone to ask their questions in a moment. But one thing that I keep thinking about from the introduction to shame-sex attraction is you note that one of the sort of intentions behind conversion therapy is a genocidal intention that it's about um making it so there aren't queer people anymore. And I think that term genocide has been like in the public mind for the last few years, between what's happening in Gaza, and I've seen people talk about what's happening with the anti-trans legislature as genocide, and yet that's sort of a term that a lot of people hear it and think, oh no, we're exaggerating what is happening. So can you talk about that, about why you would consider it genocidal, how we can combat that, and potentially how that relates to, since you've studied the Holocaust, which is absolutely genocidal, how these all connect to each other?
Yeah. So the argument that I make, and this is not an original argument, I'm basing my argument on Sue Spivey and Christine Robinson's work. They have an article titled "Genocidal Intention." So I'm 100%. I need to cite my sources because these are two badass sociologists coming out of the state of Virginia, to James Madison University. They just do phenomenal work. They're partners, and they also are research partners, and they do a lot of really amazing work. And all of their work is actually publicly accessible. So if anyone is interested, you can get access their work, and it's not behind a paywall. If you can't find it, please do email me. I'll give you my email at the end. Again, I would love to send you their work because they've made it publicly accessible. So if anyone's made it inaccessible, it shouldn't be the case. Christine and Sue, they argue, or Dr. Robinson and Dr. Spivey, I should say, they argue that conversion practices are motivated by genocidal intentions. They're not arguing that conversion practices are genocidal, nor am I arguing that conversion practices are genocidal. What we are arguing, us three, we're now a throuple, we are arguing that conversion practices are motivated by genocidal intentions. And what does that mean? And Avery, you had said this very well, and I'm just going to say it in different words, that if these folks could have their way, queer people would not exist. Right? That if in fact conversion practices could choose, there would be no queer culture, there would be no queer representation, there would be no queer community, there would be no queer vitality, there would be no queerness, there would be no queers. And I truly, and again, this, like you said, Avery, this is my background is genocide studies. I don't know how to put it any other way, that their intention is genocidal in nature. Now, the good news is that these conversion practitioners are so bad at their jobs that they've literally not once changed anyone, right? That's beautiful. There's been no erasure of these folks. There has been, perhaps you could argue, and I think it actually stands to reason, that folks have changed how they present, right? How they express their gender and or sexuality, right? And that's been, a lot of oppression, suppression, and repression. But it doesn't mean that they were actually effective. They're so horrible at their job. It's just great news. But this does not take away from two things. One, the very real consequences of conversion therapy. And there are many, right? I listed off, I think, 4 or 5. It's just a list, and it feels like it's endless, of what actually happens to those of us who undergo conversion therapy, and then the work you have to do to sort of come to terms with those consequences. The other thing, that even though they're super bad at their jobs, the other reality is that, again, their motivation, their desire is genocidal in nature, right? They have the intention to completely erase entire communities. I would say more accurately than a community. There are lots of us, right? And so this is, again, not an original argument, but it is, I think, a very fair and honest argument when we, again, look at it with, if we take a step back. I think in the beginning, if people hear like, what, you're arguing that conversion practitioners are motivated by genocidal intention, it sounds histrionic, it sounds melodramatic. But again, if we just break it down in the most simple of terms, right, we see, yeah, they want us gone. And they do their best to erase us. Again, they're horrible at their jobs, which is just wonderful news. But it doesn't take away from their intentions, and it doesn't take away from their consequences of their actions. Yeah, people lost to suicide. Yeah, exactly. There's an unbelievable erasure, 100%.
Yeah. Um, I'll open it up to other folks to ask questions. Helene, I'll read your comment out loud. Motivations are tricky to discern, right? Might it also be that an alternate identity is a threat to one's own for those who are not secure in their own? Yeah, men who won't wear pink because it's feminine. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, opening it up to other questions or comments from folks. And again, if you want to make your question anonymous, put it in the chat with anonymous like at the front of it, and I'll read it without saying your name out loud.
Hi, Jean.
Hi. Thank you so much, Lucas. I live in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is pretty good with this stuff. But I'm wondering how how can people who are, you know, I'm an ally. How can we help? What can we do?
Yeah. So I think a big part of this is raising awareness, right? So raising our voices together. And I am so grateful for allies. Um, Queer communities wouldn't be where we are without them, right? And I think some queer folks might be upset with that statement, but it's a very kind of historically substantiated claim. I'm so grateful for those who have come alongside us and fought with us. And so first and foremost, thank you. But on top of that, I also think that we need queer folks to stand up and say stuff, right? Speak alongside us. And that's not just about conversion therapy, right? Whenever I think about conversion therapy, I really just think of it as concentrated homophobia and transphobia. So if there's anything we can do to resist, to push against, to combat transphobia, to combat homophobia, that is working in service of seeing an end to conversion therapy. Will there be an end to conversion therapy? Probably not. As long as we have alt-right Christians, we're not going to see an end to this. As long as we have homophobia and transphobia, we're not going to see an end to this. So it's very much this idealized sort of like goal, but nonetheless, we still fight for it, right? That's what we want. We want to, envision a world that we want to live in, and so let's push forward towards that goal. So I think it's really about speaking up in every context, right? In every conversation that might be uncomfortable, right? Where we have family conversations. I have my brothers. I come from a family of five. I'll show you my family. The Wilsons, circa 1993. I'm the little one with the mullet. You can kind of see it's a faded photo. Anyway, I have three older brothers, and they're like super down with me being queer. They don't give two hoots. What they do care about, for whatever reason, you tell me, your guess is as good as mine, is that they draw the line at trans folks. And so every single time we hang out, every single time, we're chit-chatting and just, catching up, it always somehow comes back to trans folks. And it's like, what is this? And so every single time I have to speak up. I'm not trans, but I'm a part of the LGBTQ community, or part of LGBTQ communities. And it's just as much my responsibility as it is anyone else's responsibility, whether they're trans or cis, to speak up. We always have to be saying something whenever the opportunity arises, I think. If that's a social media post, cool. If that's resisting someone in conversation to say, hey, maybe we should reconsider that, cool. And it's not necessarily being combative, right? Like with my brothers, I don't say like, I don't throw in a bunch of expletives and say like, you shut up and whatever. Instead, what I found to be the most effective way of educating folks, and it goes back to ancient Greece, is the Socratic method, which is to say, asking questions, right? So to say like, why do you think that? Like, what about that is so uncomfortable for you that, someone is simply living their lives and you don't like the fact that they identify as, a gender that is not assigned to them at birth? What is that? Like, why are you upset by it? And to sort of put the onus on them, I think it invites people to be not only curious, right? Ideally, when you ask a question, it's inviting conversation. It's also inviting critical thinking. Ideally, again, I know that I'm living in a world of ideals. It doesn't always happen, but I think it's also an opportunity for empathy, right? To ask a question like, why is it that it bothers you so much? Like, what do you think about, their lived experience is so offensive to you, or threatening to you that you push against it? It's allowing a little bit of space for them to be empathetic and to think, what is it like to be in their shoes? Again, this is very much idealized, and I know that this is not always the case, especially when you're not talking to someone who's a good faith, in speaking in good faith, right? Like, I have people who sort of want to just like get into fights and arguments with me all the time, and it's like, okay, like chill.
Mhm.
But I do think asking questions is like the most underutilized resource that we have. And it's something that we've lost in, I don't know, maybe like the past 10, 15 years, because I feel like 10 or 15 years ago, there was a better opportunity. I'm not saying it was always the case, but I think there was a better opportunity to speak across political and religious and social divides. But I think there's been this unbelievable polarization, particularly because of social media, that has really been done a disservice to us being able to actually just have a conversation. When
Mhm.
someone is in good faith and actually wanting to engage, I don't think it's ever like I hate the claim that, I hear a lot of queer folks say, like, it's not my job to educate. And I think to myself, dear Lord, if it's not my job, then whose job is it? You know?
Exactly.
And so I think it's just a matter of speaking up. And again, it's difficult to say what to do in regards to conversion therapy because, again, what we need is a lot of legislation to not just protect children, but to protect adults, not just to protect folks who are, experiencing conversion practices under the supervision of licensed practitioners, but for everyone. And we can talk more about agency and why we should say that adults should not be able to consent to conversion therapy. It's the same thing as saying we should be able to consent to abuse. It's a crazy argument. But all this to say is that that's much more difficult for us to do. What's much more practical and what we actually can do is engage in those conversations and ask a lot of good questions.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, if there's an anonymous question next, but if you don't mind me adding on to that a little bit, Lucas, for specifically for like in the case of a progressive church, where absolutely the one-on-one conversations are so important, but also as a community, have lots of opportunities for education, especially on trans people, because there's so much misinformation. And so having those opportunities, inviting in trans preachers, so that and just sort of centering stories, the more sort of everyday trans people that a person encounters, the more likely you're going to be like, oh, they really are just living their lives. Why did I think this was such a big threat? Um, and yeah, just sort of educating yourself first so you can have those conversations. Um, know some of the trans basics and some of the main arguments people make in advance. But yeah, so for an anonymous question, I'm not from the US, so I'm still a bit baffled as how freedom of speech has been used in the US law system from your story about the SCOTUS case. From the way I heard about its applications, it seems to me to be quite a vague term. How can speech be actually free if the system is weighted to favor or protect these bigoted views, which affects the freedom of those who wanted to speak against it? Ooh.
Anonymous questioner, you tell me. I again, I'm baffled too. Um, Again, every single profession that's worth its salt has a code of conduct that you must abide by that supersedes your freedom of speech. So to say that you should be able to practice, conversion therapy in the name of free speech, it is mind-boggling. Like when I first heard that was the line of argumentation, I was like fat chance, like that's not going to be successful, and it was. I'm baffled too. And I think that a lot of folks who have their ear to the ground, particularly around the SCOTUS case, have been saying is that if it is to go back after the 10th Circuit to go to the Supreme Court, that there's a good chance it'll be struck down. But again, I don't really have a lot of faith in that Supreme Court, particularly the way it's stacked, and even more particularly the way that it voted for this last decision, where only one justice dissented. I don't know what the future holds and if it's going to be favorable anytime soon, at least before there's both an administrative change and like the court itself changes. um, that's what I think. It's not a very sort of it's a very pessimistic view, but I do think it's at least realistic.
Can I come back to Jean's question about how allies could help? I put it in the text, but being a family of choice where they've been rejected by family, being open to including them in your family stuff, is one of the strongest things of affirming and support and community for those who've been rejected because of either their orientation or being trans or whatever else it might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to be a counterexample to what a lot of people sort of expect you to be and they expect you to how they expect you to act, when you do again show them that you're just like everyone else in a very sort of basic human way, and also that you're going to sort of overlook the craziness and in some cases stupidity of people's actions and words. I think when you show them that you are different, that speaks a lot louder than their words and their hatred. Freedom of speech. Okay, am I right in thinking that freedom of speech doesn't equal freedom of consequences of that speech? Like if what you say incites violence, you're still accountable. I think in this case, again, well, you know what? I always think about homophobia and transphobia as some of the last respectable hatreds. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people will say, not in the name of free speech per se, but they'll say in the name of religion, well, that's just my belief. Or someone will excuse someone for their horrible actions or their horrible words and say, well, that's just their religious conviction, right? We can think about in a lot of Christian colleges and universities, they are exempt from a lot of discrimination policies if in fact they're discriminating on the basis of their the law refers to as sincerely held religious beliefs. So as long as you have a sincerely held religious belief as it relates to homophobia and transphobia, if you really do sincerely believe that, that's okay. Now, there are protections. We can think of protections for women, Title IX protections. We can think of protections for people of color that have been put in place. But when it came to a group of, it was a class action lawsuit, Hunter v. Hunter v. Department of Education. When this lawsuit was decided, it was decided that in the dissimilarly to how publicly funded institutions cannot discriminate on the basis of race or gender, that they can discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. So if it's what they would refer to as a biological one, then that's protected. If someone's a person of color, then that's protected, and as they should be, right? Like this is like period. There's no but. But what they said was that if you are a gender diverse person or a sexually diverse person, a sexual minority, that if a university or a college wants to discriminate against you because they have a sincerely held religious belief, they're allowed. I was a part of that class action lawsuit. I was one of the 40 plaintiffs, and we lost. And to this day, it is absolutely bonkers to me that they made that decision. But again, we have to sort of think about, the way that these different courts are stacked because of a certain administration. I won't name names, but I think you all know, and I feel like in some ways I'm exempt because I'm Canadian, but regardless, I'll be quiet, that because of this, the courts decided against the lawsuit that we brought forward. And so other than, Hillsdale College and Grove City College, one in Michigan, one in Pennsylvania. Other than these two schools, which actually do not take federal funds, so they're able to finance their own homophobia and transphobia, every other Christian university and college that you know of, I'm not talking about Bible colleges, those are their own sort of distinct class, but every college and university that is Christian, whether it be whatever denomination, these are publicly funded schools. So their homophobia and their transphobia is paid for in part by the taxpayer dollar. And something to consider. But again, this was a lawsuit. It was an unsuccessful lawsuit that tried to protect LGBTQ students at these schools. You're a Grove City alum? Oh my word. Let's talk later. I'm a Liberty. Well, you already know my secret. I'm went to Liberty.
So we're coming close to the end of our time. Does anyone have a pressing question before I want to end on a sort of more joyful or defiant note? But if anyone has a question before that.
It's not a question. I put it in the chat earlier, but it was just kind of like thanks for like pointing out that there's a difference to some extent between like conversion therapy and conversion practices, and that there are significantly more people affected by like the conversion practices. And it got me thinking like, oh, okay, yep. I've been there. But if you exactly what you said, if you had asked me like, have you ever had conversion therapy, I would have said no.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing. It's societally diffuse. Our entire society is set up on racism, misogyny, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia, transphobia, right? Name your hatred, it's there. Name your discrimination, it's there. And it's foundational to how everything operates. And so when I was a kid, and I'm even, thinking about my brother and my poor nieces and nephews, I don't know what their lives are going to be like, but I just only anticipate that they're going to be told, no, boys don't play with this, girls don't play with this. Again, it's this messaging that over time accumulates, but all of us queer kids, we all notice it. We all remember it. We can all think of the time that our mom said this. We can all think of our time that our dad said this. Actually, my dad didn't really ever say anything. It was just my mom. But my dad was phenomenal. My mom, on the other hand, Cheryl's a wild child. But all this to say is that this, like everything, we remember these things. We remember when our teacher said things. We remember the shame that we felt. Remember the guilt that we felt. Remember the anxiety of going into certain spaces because of the track record that that person or those people had, right? So this is something that, again, every single queer person has been pushed to align themselves with the heteronormative model, and thank God that we haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Amen. On the topic of, yeah, kind of that defiance of thank God that we haven't, that I'm thinking about things from your book, and I'm also thinking about if anyone has seen it, the movie But I'm a Cheerleader, which you mention in your book, that um conversion therapy is obviously a really serious thing, and yet finding humor, even like some of the stories you share in your book, finding the humor or finding a romance, like falling in love while in the midst of that horror. If there's anything you want to say about sort of humor or love as a tool of resistance, I think for me, that's like just how people manage to defy every horrible thing that the much more powerful side is just covering them in, that they're able to break out of it with things like that is always like, it means a lot. And I think it's tools we need right now.
Yeah. I'm going to put this in the chat. It's also just so that everyone has it. There's a discount code for the book. Things are too expensive these days. So please do use this discount if you're interested in the book. 24%. It's for 20% off same-sex attraction. It's only through that website. So please do use it if it's of interest. I think that humor is the most scathing critique there can be. A second ago, we were talking about all those moments we remember being, a kid or an adult, whenever, where we were humiliated, where we were made to feel ashamed, made to feel guilty, made to feel anxious, whatever. In my opinion, there's nothing worse than being laughed at, right? And again, we can think about all those times in the schoolyard, in our home, wherever, being laughed at. I think that comedy is the most scathing critique that we can make about those who support conversion practices, those who are homophobes, those who are transphobes, right? I think about the Harris Trump election, and no longer sort of being quote unquote respectable, and saying, you know what, we're gonna choose whatever avenue works, and we're gonna critique this clown and laugh out this clown for being a clown. And again, then there's often like the pushback. Well, and it's funny who calls people snowflakes, and you can't take a joke or take a critique that is sort of comedic. And so I think that when we have the ability to laugh at the other side and to point out the utter absurdity of conversion therapy, right? But I'm a cheerleader. And same with my story in same-sex attraction. My story is called gay Christian speed dating. Because what do you call a group of gay men at a Christian university put into a hot, sweaty room to meet once a week to change their gender and sexuality? It's called gay Christian speed dating. You know what I mean? And so that is a critique. Again, but I'm a cheerleader is a critique. It's just showing the inherent absurdity of conversion therapy and also homophobia and transphobia more broadly, right? And so I think that when we are able to laugh at these folks and show them in a really not just intellectual way, because I think a lot of these stories and these representations and movies and whatnot are intellectual, but they're also very much affective, which is to say emotional, right? And so when you use these emotions to your favor, just as much as they use these emotions to their favor, I mean, like, what is evangelicalism other than a lot of emotion? You go to a worship service and you're crying. You're like, why am I crying? I don't even believe this. But, it's this manufacturing of emotion. But I think when we use comedy, when we use sarcasm, when we use satire and we are making fun of the inherent absurdity of their hatred, it just shines a light on who they are and what they say in a way that's, again, kind of humiliating. But again, I think that it's politically efficacious. It's politically, effective, in a way that I don't think just an argument would be otherwise. I mean, this is one avenue that we can take, right? Humor. Another avenue, like Avery had said, storytelling. And I think when we put those two together, we find a really effective way of pushing against this hatred. Will it always be effective? Nah. But is it sometimes effective? Yeah. And I think that it at least bare minimum offers people pause to reflect and think, why do I feel so ashamed or embarrassed or humiliated when, they just kind of held a mirror up to me and showed me, what I was saying in different terms. There's a reason why they feel that way. And again, it's because they know that it's wrong. They know that it's immoral. And they know that what they're doing is, not right. And so I think that humor is one way of shining a spotlight on that injustice and magnifying it in a way that's really, again, politically effective.
I love it. Lucas, thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm sure Jesse, you can include in the YouTube video in the discount for your book. I haven't gotten through all of it yet, but I've loved what I've read so far, so I highly recommend it. Um, yeah, that's all I got for closing. If anyone wants to, if you want to end, Lucas, with any last words, otherwise, I hope everyone has a good night.
I had that one comment I posted when you were talking about what is effective, and in my case, it was remembering something from way back in communicants class. Churches and councils can err, and when you say ask questions, um, is this real? Is what somebody's telling me real, or is this an error?
Mhm.
Because I know my truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, no, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with y'all. Very exciting to be in conversation. I just put in my social media handles. And so if anyone's interested in following along, connecting, and finding out what's next, please do send me a message or yeah, what's the word? Send a follow, make a follow. I don't know what it is. I'm like a 99. Yeah, I don't understand social media. Anyway, my email is in there as well. And so please, yeah, send me a message if you have any questions or if I can send anything else along. But it's been an absolute pleasure to chat with y'all tonight. And I look forward to the next time.
Yay.
Thank you, Lucas,
Thank
and
you,
thank you,
Lucas.
Avery. Thank you, everybody who came this evening. This will be on YouTube, as we said. And again, those of you who wanted to remain anonymous, you won't be seen or your name won't be said. I'm going to put a link in the chat. In order to continue to do this work together as More Light Presbyterians, we do need your support. We don't do this work for free, unfortunately. And it does take money to be able to sustain the ministry that we do. So if you want to continue to have these conversations and participate in More Light Monday, we ask that you please, as you're able, give a donation if you can. But until next month, the second Monday of the month, we'll see you in August. And please look for this link on YouTube, and we'll see you all next time. Good night, everybody.